Welcome back. Let's take a look at another important access control feature on vSphere called lockdown mode. What is lockdown mode? This is a really powerful way to ensure only the appropriate services are running on an ESXi host. Not just who can log in, that's actually a big part of this, but actually what services are running on that host and how is that host to be accessed. Essentially what lockdown mode does is it basically puts vCenter as the only way into an ESXi host. That basically means any other means to access that host over the network has been disabled, with one exception, the direct console user interface. However, there's actually some options here. You'll notice that in lockdown mode, some services are disabled and some services are accessible only to certain users. So it is a very selective way to really prevent any type of access to that host. Now, there's two modes for lockdown mode. There's what's called normal lockdown mode, and then there's strict lockdown mode. Normal lockdown mode is good. It's actually great for a lot of corporate types of environments. Strict lockdown mode's getting pretty serious, but whenever security is a concern, you always have to weigh the balance here of what's more important. Is security more important, or is being able to manage and maintain and operate and so on? So the lockdown mode, normal lockdown mode, is a good balance of making it stricter to get to the host while still have other ways to manage the system in cases of an emergency. But strict lockdown mode, you're putting the onus really on security over everything else. So it is disabled by default anyway, right? Lockdown mode isn't enabled and we can access the host through any means. Now, of course, you need to ensure are the SSH services enabled? Is the local shell services enabled? If it's enabled, you have to justify why that's enabled. You can turn them off as a best practice. Now, with lockdown mode, what do we have here, right? Lockdown mode, no matter whether it's normal lockdown mode or if it's in strict lockdown mode, right away what that does is it disables any access to the host directly over the network. So the shell service, blocked. Local shell service, that's actually through the console, that's blocked. And host client access is blocked. Also worth noting, it's not shown in the slide here, any API access to the host is blocked. So the only way to access that host is through vCenter and through just the console of that host itself. Right? So when you enable lockdown mode, doesn't matter, normal, strict, no users but the administrator, right? Basically, the vCenter user is the user who's going to be able to gain access to that host. Now, there's some interesting exceptions that you can make in how lockdown mode works. And you have to be careful with some of these exceptions, but they are there for those who need this, right? So basically, normal lockdown mode behaves like this. The host is accessed only by vCenter, right? By the vSphere client, basically. The DCUI is up and running and as accessible, but it's not just the DCUI where, in an ESXi host, there really shouldn't be too many users on that host, right? There's the root user, and then there's the VPX user, the one that's used by vCenter, right? When a host is in lockdown mode, those are the only accounts that count. VPX user can be accessed over the network, and the root user can be accessed over the DCUI. And so that's really what happens here when you put the host in lockdown mode. Those are the only users that could access the host. If you happen to have added other users to the system, they will be filtered out. Unless you adjust an exception users list, right? You have maybe a reason to have an exception in your policy, so you can create an exception user list. This actually is available right when you set up lockdown mode. In that main wizard page, you'll see the exception users. There's nobody in this list. If anybody's in that list, what happens? Well, first of all, access to the DCUI is restricted to certain users. It's restricted to users on the exception users list. Well, it's to say its access is restricted to certain users. Anybody who's in the exception users list is allowed, provided they have administrator privileges. So not only do you need to be a valid user on your ESX server, and you need to have been set as an administrator, and you would have to be on the exception users list in order to bypass the filter that's on the direct console user interface. Also, there is an advanced host setting called DCUI access, right? So that's an advanced setting that's not in the UI so much. I mean, it's in the advanced service system settings in the UI, but it's not part of any wizard. And so if you open up the DCUI access list, there actually is one user in that list. It's the root user, right? So by default, the root user is defined in that setting. That's the one user who is allowed access to the DCUI because guess what? He's in that list. If you are a non-admin account, that is in this list, right? Well, then what happens? If you're a non-admin that's in that list, right? So the account is in the DCUI users list. They're basically there so that they can do one thing. They can gain access to the host and disable lockdown mode. Now, why on earth would we want to do that? Right? Have somebody who is a non-admin account. They could log in, but all they can do is disable lockdown mode, right? Because remember what we just mentioned in the previous lesson. There's these services that we can turn on or turn off, right? SSH and local shell. We can do that shell services management from the DCUI as well. Well, what could happen here is, what if you have a emergency? vCenter is offline and you need to gain access to an ESX server. You might need to gain access to the ESX server that is running the vCenter virtual machine. And if vCenter is not online, how on earth are you going to be able to gain access to the host to try to reboot the vCenter server if that server is in lockdown mode? Well, you could actually log into the DCUI as root because that user actually is allowed in. And then you can go in and turn lockdown mode off and then try to go in using the host client to have easier access to managing that host. But if you don't have that root password, you're going to be stuck. You could have maybe a select number of people who have non-admin privileges that allows them to at least, log into the DCUI and disable lockdown mode so that then they can all log in over the host client. Right? Now, one other interesting thing is that when you enable lockdown mode, what this does is it basically puts that filter on the console, right? The only way you're going to get access to the console is if you're in the DCUI users list or you're an administrator on the exception users list. However, if you do log into the vSphere client, you are actually able to turn on the SSH services and the local shell service. You can turn those services on. Even though lockdown mode basically turns them off, you can turn them on independently of lockdown mode. So lockdown mode basically says, okay, turning everything off, but you're not prevented from turning on SSH. If you turn on SSH, so now you kind of have set up an exception here, right? You've got the server in a supposed locked state, but yet you can turn on SSH. The only users that can connect into SSH, though, are users that are on the exception users list. And in order to actually log in and have a shell, you'll need to log in with an account that's on an administrative level privileges. So if, as it says on the bottom there, if the shell and SSH services are enabled, right, they're not normally, and this would be an unusual thing, but if you enable the services, any users with administrative privileges who are on the exception users list can log into the host directly using SSH or the local shell service. So typically where this is probably more useful is since the API calls are also blocked by having a host in lockdown mode, having a service account on your ESXi host that has limited permissions, where then you needed to access that host over API calls, having that kind of user in an exception user list can be pretty helpful. But in an emergency, if you needed a quick command line access, if you're in the exception users list, that's what it's there for. But best practice is to leave these lists with nobody in them. Now, what's strict lockdown mode? Strict lockdown mode basically is the exact same thing as normal. However, one final additional change is that the DCUI service is disabled, cannot be restarted, right? So while it's in strict lockdown mode, the only way you gain access to the host is through vCenter. This is where this becomes a little bit more of a challenge in your day-to-day operations, right? Because if vCenter is now offline, how are you going to be able to gain access to the host because the DCUI service is actually stopped and it cannot be restarted? So it does not matter if you're in the DCUI access list. It doesn't matter if you're in the exception users list. The service is not running. There is no DCUI. So normal strict lockdown mode basically says, okay, no SSH, no shell, no DCUI, no API calls. The only way into that host is through vCenter. So if your vCenter is offline, in emergency where there's no vCenter, you'll be likely booting your ESX server from some kind of bootable media to gain access to it. That adds a whole new challenge to managing the system, right? So you could still, if needed, start the SSH service. And if you're in the exception user list and you're an administrator, you still gain access to that system shell. But again, that's not a good practice. So very, very powerful features and very useful for environments that need this type of protection. Normal lockdown mode, though, is quite useful in a variety of different customer environments. By the way, instead of having to come up with a set of local user accounts, you can also join your ESXi host to an AD domain. And if you've done that, you no longer have to add users manually to your ESXi host. The users can just log in with their domain accounts. In fact, if a host joins an AD domain, don't forget the host will automatically grant any user who might be in your AD group called ESXadmins. So again, this doesn't necessarily exist, but if you've created an AD group called ESXadmins and you've joined a host to the AD domain, any user who's in that ESXadmins group will be automatically granted admin privileges on your host. So you'd have a select number of maybe ESXi admins that would have this type of privilege. Oh, by the way, when it comes to those exception users and the users that are in the DCUI access list, exception users can be AD accounts, or they can be local accounts, right? So the exception users, there is no restriction on where the users could be defined. AD accounts, local accounts, they're both acceptable for those exception users. So then that could actually be somebody that you might have here in the ESXadmins group. If you've added your host to AD domain, if you're in the ESXadmins group and you have admin privileges and you've enabled the SSH service, that user can gain access to that host. On the other side, the DCUI access list, those users can only be local accounts, cannot be domain accounts. So DCUI access, local only. Exception users can be local or AD accounts. And if you're using auto deploy, if you remember we talked about auto deploy in the previous module, the hosts don't necessarily have a boot drive, they're stateless. And so then the host can't save AD credentials anywhere. If you are in that situation where you're running Active Direct, you're running auto deploy in a stateless fashion, then you'll need to start up what's called the Authentication proxy service. It runs on the vCenter server, and basically what happens is vCenter will proxy your credentials on the ESX server for connecting to Active Directory. So this is normally disabled, this proxy service, but it can be enabled for those situations. You're running auto deploy on stateless hosts where those hosts need to join Active Directory. This can proxy the authentication for us. So that was a look at the host access control and authorizations. We showed you configuring the ESX server firewall by enabling and disabling services. We showed you enabling and disabling lockdown mode. And we showed configuring user logins to authenticate with direct your services by joining an ESXi host to an AD domain. So that ends our lesson. We'll take a quick break, and we'll see you in the next lesson.